In December of 1944, Toronto was hit by a snowstorm that would go down in history as one of the most intense and disruptive the city had ever seen. The storm began on Sunday, December 10th, and continued until Wednesday, December 13th, blanketing the city in a thick layer of snow. The storm was so powerful that it brought life in Toronto to a complete standstill. The snow piled up quickly, with estimates saying that the city received between 12 and 30 inches, or 30 to 76 centimeters of snow in just 3 days. The snowstorm wasn't just a lot of snow. It came with high winds that caused snow drifts to reach as high as 3 meters, or nearly 10 feet. These drifts trapped people inside their homes and made it nearly impossible for anyone to get around. At the heart of this massive snowstorm were two separate weather systems. One storm came from the west, dropping snow across the Midwest and the Great Plains. Another storm moving up from the southern Atlantic coast brought in additional moisture. As these two storms met over the eastern Great Lakes region, the result was a powerful weather system that produced snow, sleet, freezing rain, and fierce winds. Toronto was right in the middle of it all. The storm arrived slowly at first, with flurries starting on December 11th, but by midnight it intensified quickly. By the morning of December 12th, the storm was in full force. The snow fell heavily, with over 19 inches, or nearly 50 centimeters, of snow accumulating that day alone. For the people of Toronto, the storm was overwhelming. The roads were quickly covered and public transportation ground to a halt. Even the city's famous streetcars, which were a major part of Toronto's public transport system, were stuck. The snow was so deep that it made it impossible for buses to run. And commuter train services were also disrupted. At one point, it was reported that only the Yonge, King, and Queen streetcar lines managed to stay in operation. But even then, the service was slow, and the snow kept filling in the cleared tracks. Schools and businesses closed as the city struggled to cope with the snowstorm. The University of Toronto, the Toronto Stock Exchange, and many department stores remained shut for the day. In fact, an estimated 80% of businesses in the city didn't open on December 12th. The local newspapers, such as the Toronto Daily Star and the Globe and Mail, had their operations affected as well. On December 12th, the Toronto Daily Star published only a limited number of copies, and the Globe and Mail had to cancel its December 13th edition entirely. Emergency services were overwhelmed by the storm. Ambulances, fire trucks, and other emergency vehicles couldn't get through the snow to reach those who needed help. People who were stranded in the snow were left waiting for hours, and emergency response times were slow. Hospitals became overcrowded with patients, and the Red Cross set up shelters to assist those in need. At one point, workers of the Victory Aircraft Factory in Malton, located just outside Toronto, were stranded for over 12 hours due to snowdrifts that completely blocked the road to their homes. Some workers had to spend the night in nearby schools and service stations as they waited for the storm to let up. It wasn't just workers in industrial areas that were affected. Entire neighborhoods found themselves isolated by the heavy snow. In addition to the danger the snow brought, the cold temperatures also posed a serious threat. Power lines were snapped by the wind, leaving many homes without electricity. For some, the lack of power meant no heat during a brutal winter storm. To make matters worse, many of the city's water pumps froze, and this further threatened the water supply. With grocery stores and businesses closed and the roads blocked, food deliveries into the city were severely limited. By December 12th, only 3% of the usual milk supply was able to reach Toronto. To make sure residents had enough, the mayor had to request people to limit their consumption of milk and bread. Emergency food supplies were distributed to fire halls, where people could purchase what they needed. It was a tough time for the people of Toronto, but this was just the beginning of the storm's impact. As the snow continued to fall, it soon became clear that this was going to be one of the most severe storms in Toronto's history, and it would take days, even weeks, for the city to recover. As the storm raged on through December 12th, the situation in Toronto grew more desperate. The city's streets were buried under thick snow, and residents found themselves trapped in their homes or stranded wherever they happened to be. With snowdrifts piling up as high as 3 meters, moving around the city became almost impossible. The government declared that only essential services could be active, and the mayor urged people to stay home unless they absolutely needed to be out. For many, this was not just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. By the morning of December 13th, Toronto had received more than 22 inches or 57 centimeters of snow, and it was clear that the storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon. The wind picked up, making the snow blow even harder, and temperatures continued to plummet, turning everything into a frozen, treacherous landscape. Those who had already been stranded the day before found themselves completely stuck, unable to even get to a store or find warmth. Emergency vehicles and ambulances could barely navigate the snow, and people began to worry about running out of essential supplies like food and fuel. Transportation throughout the city was halted. Only a small number of streetcar lines managed to remain open, but even those had trouble keeping up with the ever-deepening snow. For residents who depended on buses to get around, service was completely suspended. Commuter train services were almost completely blocked, leaving entire neighborhoods isolated. Suburbs like Weston, Leaside, and Long Branch became cut off from the rest of the city, and those stuck in these areas were unable to get help. In some cases, workers were stranded in factories or other workplaces as the roads became impassable. With so many businesses and services closed, the city's ability to function began to break down. Factories that were vital to the war effort, like the Victory aircraft plant in Malton, were unable to run because workers couldn't get to work. In fact, some employees found themselves trapped for over 12 hours, spending the night in schools and nearby service stations. The city was essentially on lockdown, with no way to bring in the supplies needed to maintain daily life. The supply of essential goods, especially food and milk, was dangerously low. The snowstorm didn't just impact businesses and transportation. It also affected Toronto's hospitals and emergency services. With ambulances unable to get through to transport patients, hospitals became crowded with people who were injured or sick. The emergency rooms were overflowing, and doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to care for everyone. The storm also kept people inside their homes for longer periods, making it more difficult to deal with common winter illnesses or injuries. The situation was further complicated by the power outages caused by the storm. As the winds picked up, trees and power lines were knocked down, leaving much of the city without electricity. The cold made it almost unbearable for those stuck without heat, and with no way to cook food, many were left depending on whatever supplies they had left in their homes. By the evening of December 12th, the mayor issued a public request for residents to conserve food and water, asking that everyone be cautious about how much they consumed until supplies could be brought back into the city. Despite the massive effort to dig out from under the snow, some neighborhoods remained completely blocked with little to no access. People in these areas had to wait for emergency crews to clear the roads, and it wasn't until December 14th that most suburban bus and train services were finally restored. The roads were still covered in snow, and the snow drifts that had buried the streets made travel slow and dangerous. It became clear that this wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a disaster, and it would take much longer for Toronto to recover than anyone had expected. Yet despite the overwhelming challenges, there were signs of hope. People came together, helping their neighbors and working as a community to make it through the storm. The storm was a true test of Toronto's resilience, and even as the city struggled to clear its streets, the citizens' efforts and solidarity during these difficult days would go down in history as an example of the strength of a community in the face of adversity. The people of Toronto would never forget the Great Snowstorm of 1944, as it left a lasting impact on the city and its people, forever changing how they approached future winter storms. By December 15th, Toronto was still reeling from the aftermath of the Great Snowstorm of 1944. Though emergency services and snowplows were making progress in clearing the roads, many areas remained inaccessible. The weight of the snow on rooftops, coupled with the freezing temperatures, caused serious damage across the city. Buildings were collapsing and infrastructure was under immense strain. The municipal government urged residents to stay indoors and not attempt to shovel snow or clear block streets, as the danger of further damage was high. The weather didn't show any signs of relenting. On the morning of December 16th, a new wave of snow began to fall, compounding the already chaotic situation. The city had now been blanketed in over 28 inches of snow, nearly 70 centimeters. The accumulation continued to grow, and the heavy snow resulted in widespread roof collapses in both residential and commercial buildings. Emergency responders had to rush to affected areas, trying to rescue people trapped under fallen debris. It was a race against time, as the freezing temperatures meant that hypothermia and frostbite were major concerns for those caught in the wreckage. In some neighborhoods, residents took matters into their own hands, organizing makeshift rescue teams to help dig out the snow and assist those who were unable to do so themselves. These acts of kindness became a common sight across the city, as people braved the freezing conditions to help one another. The city's hospitals were still overwhelmed with patients, and the lack of medical resources was becoming an increasing concern. Some patients had to be transported by snowmobile or horse-drawn sleds due to the difficulty in getting an ambulance through the snow. Despite these efforts, the healthcare system struggled to keep up with the growing number of injuries, illnesses, and medical emergencies. The storm also had a profound impact on the city's schools. Many schools across Toronto were closed, and students were kept at home for longer than usual. With transportation services still not fully restored, teachers and administrators struggled to reach schools, and even if they managed to make it, the lack of power in many buildings made it impossible to carry out normal classes. For several days, children remained at home, with parents trying to keep them safe and warm as the storm continued. With supply lines still cut off, food shortages were becoming more apparent. Grocery stores had limited stock, and the long lines for what few items were available were a daily occurrence. Residents had to ration what they had, as there was no clear timeline for when regular deliveries would resume. While some stores remained open, they could not offer much in the way of fresh produce or perishable goods. Canned and dried foods were in high demand, and people became inventive with what little they had left. On December 17th, the provincial government declared a state of emergency, allowing additional resources to be deployed to help with the recovery efforts. Plows worked in shifts, clearing major routes and attempting to open up access to the suburbs. But even after days of relentless work, many of the streets remained impassable. The sheer scale of the snowstorm had caught everyone by surprise, and it was evident that it would take weeks to fully recover. Despite these challenges, the resilience of the people continued to shine through. Volunteers organized community kitchens in some neighborhoods, providing hot meals to those who couldn't leave their homes. Many people opened their doors to strangers who needed a place to stay, and local businesses offered what they could to help those in need. In times of such hardship, the sense of community grew stronger, and the people of Toronto showed an incredible spirit of unity. In the weeks that followed, the city slowly started to rebuild. The heavy snow began to subside, and by the end of December, most of the main roads were passable again. The snow plows continued to clear away the remaining drifts, and the sounds of life slowly returned to the city. The Great Snowstorm of 1944 had left an indelible mark on Toronto, and the memory of those harrowing days would stay with the citizens for years to come. The storm had tested the limits of the city's infrastructure, but it also revealed the strength of its people, their ability to adapt, and their unwavering commitment to each other in the face of adversity. By January 3rd, 1945, the worst of the Great Snowstorm of 1944 had finally passed, but the effects were still being felt across Toronto. The damage to homes, businesses, and infrastructure was extensive, and many parts of the city remained without power. With recovery efforts still ongoing, city officials focused on restoring essential services, but the challenges seemed endless. In the aftermath of the storm, numerous organizations came together to assist in the relief efforts, each doing their part to rebuild the city. Emergency shelters had been set up throughout the city, providing temporary housing to those whose homes had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable due to collapsed roofs. These shelters were vital in offering a safe haven for families, some of whom had been forced to leave their homes and take refuge in community centers and schools. The government, as well as charitable groups, organized relief programs to distribute food, clothing, and basic supplies to those in need. Volunteers worked tirelessly, often braving the cold to help families access what little food and water remained available. Despite the hardships, the people of Toronto continued to demonstrate resilience. Many residents took it upon themselves to check on their neighbors, especially the elderly and vulnerable, making sure that they had access to food and warmth. Some individuals set up informal neighborhood repair teams, assisting those whose homes had suffered significant damage. In a city where many families had already been struggling before the storm, this sense of solidarity was crucial to the community's survival in the months that followed. At the same time, the city faced significant challenges in restoring transportation. The public transit system, which had been a vital part of daily life before the storm, was still in disarray. Snowdrifts remained on many tracks, and buses and streetcars were limited in their ability to navigate the blocked streets. The few vehicles that were able to make it through the snow did so with great difficulty. It wasn't until the second week of January that normal bus routes and streetcar services were gradually reestablished, allowing people to resume their daily routines, though the process was slow. The damage to homes and buildings was far-reaching. Thousands of roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and rebuilding efforts were hampered by a shortage of construction materials. Many families who had been displaced faced the uncertainty of when they could return to their homes. As the snow began to melt, the extent of the damage was laid bare. Streets that had been impassable for days were now filled with debris, with piles of snow and wreckage being cleared away by a combination of workers and volunteers. Though many areas of the city were slowly returning to normal, some parts of Toronto were still without basic services. Water and heating systems had been disrupted in several neighborhoods, and the freezing temperatures made it difficult for families to stay warm. The shortage of fuel meant that people had to ration heating supplies carefully, relying on fireplaces or makeshift stoves to stay warm. Even in places where power had been restored, outages still occurred intermittently, further complicating recovery efforts. By the end of January, the storm's aftermath had begun to take a toll on the mental health of residents. The emotional impact of the storm was immense, with many individuals feeling isolated and overwhelmed by the challenges of rebuilding their lives. Support groups and counselors began to offer their services to those struggling with the emotional effects of the disaster, helping people process their experiences and regain a sense of hope. The winter of 1945 was marked by the continued fight for recovery. In the months following the storm, rebuilding efforts ramped up, and the city began to emerge from the devastation. New measures were put in place to prevent similar damage in future storms, such as reinforcing roofs and improving the snow removal infrastructure. While it would take years to fully recover from the Great Snowstorm of 1944, the resilience of the people of Toronto had been proven time and time again. They had weathered the worst of the storm together and had begun to rebuild their city piece by piece. As the spring of 1945 arrived, the city of Toronto began to show signs of recovery. But the scars left by the Great Snowstorm of 1944 were still visible. The damage was far-reaching, and the storm's effects were felt long after the snow had melted. However, the determination of Toronto's residents to rebuild their city was undeniable. In the face of a disaster that seemed impossible to overcome, the community came together, proving that resilience and unity could overcome even the harshest of circumstances. The rebuilding process took months and in some cases years, but Toronto's infrastructure gradually improved. The experience of the storm led to a greater awareness of the city's vulnerability to extreme weather events, and new measures were introduced to ensure that the city was better prepared for future storms. This included improvements to the public transportation system, more robust construction standards for homes and businesses, and enhanced emergency response protocols. These changes helped make Toronto more resilient in the face of future natural disasters. One of the most lasting legacies of the Great Snowstorm was the sense of community that emerged in the aftermath. People from all walks of life came together to help their neighbors, volunteering their time and resources to aid in recovery efforts. The bonds formed during this challenging period became a symbol of Toronto's strength and solidarity. In the years that followed, this spirit of cooperation remained a central part of the city's identity. By the summer of 1945, much of the damage had been repaired, and life began to return to normal for many residents. Businesses reopened, families returned to their homes, and the streets were once again filled with activity. The storm may have left its mark on Toronto, but it also revealed the power of community, determination, and hope. In the end, the Great Snowstorm of 1944 served as a reminder of the unpredictable forces of nature and the importance of being prepared for the worst. It also highlighted the incredible resilience of Toronto's people, who faced one of the most severe winter storms in history, with courage and unity. While the storm's impact would never be forgotten, it was the collective effort to rebuild and move forward that ultimately defined the city's response to the disaster. As time passed, the memories of the Great Snowstorm faded, but the lessons learned from it continued to shape the city's approach to disaster preparedness and community resilience. Toronto emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected, with a renewed sense of pride in the strength of its people. The storm may have been a dark chapter in the city's history, but it also marked the beginning of a new era of cooperation, rebuilding, and hope for the future.